Oh, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you are all well in this tough time. And with the organizer, we warmly welcome the expert all around the world and to join our workshop. And with a lot of interesting email exchange and engagement before the workshop. So the host is coming from the 3 SNV office in Hanoi. So from the Hanoi office, Ho Chi Minh office, and also Đà Lạt office, we are very happy to have you here today. And today with the consultation workshop, I hope you have read the material I sent earlier yesterday. And today we are going to discuss a very challenging and exciting topic on the NDC planning, climate change, and above all is the gender issues. As you all know, Vietnam has passed the planning law and entering the new decade, looking forward to 2030 and also the vision to 2050. So we are all here take part in the history to support Vietnam and all of the province to achieve the greener and greater economy toward the green growth, resilient to climate change. Some of the province now is formulating one of the planning that replace all the 15 plannings. So that is the complexity, and we're adding the NDC and climate change into this planning is also a great opportunity as well as the great challenge and complexity. In addition, we haven't mentioned about gender responsive framework into this complicated process, and that's why we are very happy to have NDC partnership and its partner to support this process. We also very appreciate your presence here with us today and contribute to the this tough issue. The NDC partnership or NDCP is a global coalition of the country and institution collaborating to drive transformation climate action through sustainable development. And through partnership, members leverage their resource and expertise to provide country with the tool or the need to implement their NDC and combating climate change to be a better future. So in Vietnam, the NDC member SNV, Netherlands Development Organization, World Resource Institute, WRI, and World Bank are providing co-finance and attempting to provide technical support requested by MPI. So at this online event, SNV and WRI will share their approach and lesson learned from providing support to NDC mainstreaming into the provincial planning process. And this invite, we will have the comment and feedback into the gender sensitive framework. So today we want to share with you the journey over the past 15 months. We went through this tough issue, and that's recalling our kickoff workshop July last year before the COVID time. So we at that time we are able to meet together in Hanoi. And as we mentioned in the agenda, we will share the result of NDC mainstreaming into the provincial planning, apply the green economy model and stakeholder consultation. Then we will share the gender responsive framework, and we will have a chance to have your opinion and discussion about this issue. So coming up next in the agenda, let me share with you the opening remark from Ms. Amanda McKee, the head of knowledge management and the head of CAP from the NDC partnership. This is pre-record due to the time frame, so she cannot join with us live today, but she kindly enough to provide the recording. So please.
Good morning, esteemed government officials from the Ministry of Planning and Investment, Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment, the Provincial People's Committee from Lum Dong, Ben Tre, and Quang Ninh, other government agencies, as well as colleagues from implementing and development partners. On behalf of the NDC partnership, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to provide some remarks at this important final consultation. I'd like to start by applauding the Ministry of Planning and Investment, SNV, and WRI for their invaluable work on mainstreaming NDCs into provincial planning in the 3 provinces. The strong commitment is truly necessary in the face of increasing disaster risks brought about by climate change. The recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report presented a stark warning that every region in the world will experience increasing occurrence and intensity of climate impacts, including loss of land and coastal infrastructures, more intense cyclones, droughts, and many others. The report is a clarion call that every country in the world must act now to mitigate carbon emissions and strengthen adaptive capabilities. Nevertheless, profound progress has been made in Vietnam's updated NDC in terms of quality, process, and ambition. The NDC features stronger mitigation and adaptation commitments. It identifies economy-wide mitigation measures for the period 2021 to 2030, has updated the base year from 2010 to 2014 with higher quality data, and increased the unconditional emission reduction target to 9% by 2030. The NDC partnership is proud to have supported Vietnam and many other countries in the NDC update process through our Climate Action Enhancement Package, or CAP. And building on prior NDC partnership support on the NDC review and update delivered by GAZ, UNDP, and the World Bank. By way of 46 of our members, we have been supporting 67 countries globally to strengthen their NDC update and accelerate implementation. Like Vietnam, these countries have developed NDCs that are more comprehensive, more ambitious, more implementable, and more credible with key targets and measures to track and demonstrate progress. The NDC goals, however, will not be achieved unless efforts are implemented across various levels of government and communities. The NDC partnership is grateful for its members SNB and WRI, who have been working tirelessly on the ground to support the government in this endeavor, despite various limitations brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. Participants can look forward to hearing more about the great work that they've done in the provinces during today's sessions. Vietnam is not alone in its endeavor to mainstream the NDC at the subnational level. We are seeing several strong examples throughout the region. Nepal, for instance, with the support of UNDP and Climate Analytics, has convened 7 multi-stakeholder provincial level consultations to inform stakeholders about the NDC and its priority actions, as well as to gather inputs to inform the process and mechanisms for localization of the NDC implementation approach. The stakeholders involved included provincial level governments, private sector, academia, and civil society organizations. In Pakistan, WWF and UNDP are supporting the government in carrying out stakeholder consultations with all key sectors throughout 4 provinces and 2 regions to determine pipeline projects that would contribute towards NDC implementation. These consultations include relevant stakeholders and experts from each sector to identify current best practices and recommend interventions to meet the country's GHG emissions reduction target. And in Indonesia, an extensive socialization process around the NDC and long-term strategy is ongoing, supported by GDGI, through organizing a series of subnational consultations and coordination meetings on the updated NDC, as well as a broad public campaign to engage stakeholders at all levels of climate action. This way, the government aims to generate commitment on implementing the NDC from all relevant stakeholders. Notably, women and disadvantaged groups are disproportionately affected by the negative effects of the climate crisis. They also face unequal access to economic resources, climate-related information, and decision-making. At the same time, women hold enormous potential to be agents of change in the global fight against climate change. We must therefore continue to strive to understand the gender differentiated impacts of climate change, empower all people regardless of gender by addressing the barriers that persist, and finally harness the knowledge, strengths, and contribution of all people in implementing the NDCs. I would like to commend the government for their laudable efforts in mainstreaming gender considerations into the national and provincial development plans. Indeed, Vietnam's progress in mainstreaming gender considerations can be an example for the region and the world, and we would be keen to share these best practices throughout the partnership. I applaud my colleagues in SNV who have been supporting the government closely by developing capacity building materials, conducting trainings, reviewing provincial and sectoral development plans with the gender lens, and contributing to the development of a gender sensitive framework for mainstreaming NDC targets in provincial planning. In closing, I'd like to reiterate that the NDC partnership stands ready to support Vietnam's NDC implementation at speed and at scale. We urge the government and all partners to continue in the spirit of cooperation, where goodwill from the people of Vietnam must be matched by goodwill from developed countries, international organizations, and donor institutions to keep the momentum for ambitious and impactful climate action going. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring story and climate action around the world from the NDC partnership. And coming up next, I want to introduce Mr. Richard Rasto, SNV Agriculture Sector Leader. We have the opening remark. Thank you.
Thank you, Nam. And thank you also to Amanda for an excellent introduction and overview to this workshop. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning a critical decade in terms of climate change. As Amanda has already noted, the IPCC AR6 report has identified the huge challenges we face. It's also a critical decade for Vietnam in terms of its socioeconomic development and progress. We have some positive news this last few days in terms of the fight against climate change, with a return from the United States committing $11 million to the cause. And we also had good news from the People's Republic of China in their commitments to transition away from coal. But these glimmers of hope against a backdrop where, in the end, developed countries are likely to fall very well short of the promised $100 billion per year. There are also many reports over the last few months that the collective efforts on NDCs are not sufficient. We are still likely on track for 3 degrees or more global heating. It is therefore doubly important that NDC commitments are actually translated to action on the ground. And to do that, it is important or essential that NDCs are mainstreamed in subnational planning. Vietnam, as we all know, is one of the countries that is likely to be worst impacted by climate change. And indeed, over the last decade or so in particular, we have observed that climate change is already impacting economic sectors and the livelihoods of people in Vietnam. Vietnam has taken a strong position and a positive role in climate change negotiations and became one of the first countries to update its NDC with more ambitious commitments outlined by Amanda earlier and approved last year in 2020. At the same time as making these commitments, Vietnam has been embarking on a process of strategic planning for the next 10 and 5-year cycles. These are national, sectoral, regional, and provincial. And these aim also to make Vietnam become an upper middle income country by 2030. It's fair to say, like many other countries, there's been a bit of a stuttering, stumbling start to this decade. But history has shown many times that Vietnam and its people are strong, resilient, dynamic, entrepreneurial, smart, and above all else, driven. They have certainly the capacity to recover and recover strongly from the COVID-19 pandemic. But how Vietnam gets there and what that future looks like is extremely important. Can it do it in a green and sustainable way? In this context, the NDCP and through the CAP, the Climate Action and Enhancement Package, the government, which as Amanda's outlined, provides the opportunity for countries to update and raise the ambition of their NDC and also to fast track climate action. The support in Vietnam, the government of Vietnam has requested support under the first of those, whilst already by 2020, Vietnam was well underway in terms of finalizing its updated NDC. Therefore, the government of Vietnam had the foresight to then think about, well, how are these NDC ambitions and targets going to be mainstreamed into provincial plans? So that was the nature of the request from MPI and the government of Vietnam to the CARE. And the NDCP members have responded to that. Amanda has also mentioned some of the efforts by other development partners, such as GIZ and UNDP. But under the CARE, the World Bank, WRI, and SNV have been supporting the efforts there. WRI has supported piloting of the green economy model in 3 target provinces, and SNV has collaborated with WRI in Lâm Đồng, and these efforts have also been co-financed by another one of our projects, which is under the International Climate Initiative of the German government. And in that project, we aim to achieve green, low-carbon, deforestation-free pathway for one of the districts in Lâm Đồng, and therefore provides an opportunity both to achieve our own objectives under that project, but also to expand and to offer additional support to the province. And we also know that it's important, given the hierarchical nature of Vietnamese planning processes, to ensure green growth development pathways in the provincial plan in order to have the impacts at the district level. And we do that in partnership with many of the development partners also that are active in Lâm Đồng, including GIZ, UNDP, IDH, ICRAF, UNEP, and others. And indeed, in that process, we build on the Green Growth Action Plan developed for Lâm Đồng and also approved earlier in this year. Both WRI and SNV have worked together to review the NDC, also the key relevant climate change and green growth policies at the national level. We've reviewed the plans and policies at the provincial level, and collected relevant data to provide inputs for the analysis, which has been performed using the green economy model, and we will hear about. We'll be privileged to hear more about that today from Dr. Andrea Bassi, who is an associate working together with the New Climate Economy and WRI. So we will hear about that technical approach. We have supported consultations, we've supported training, and leading to the finalization of a report submitted to MPI and also to the province, intended to act as an input to those 3 provinces' provincial planning processes this year. Recognizing, as Amanda also outlined, that climate change impacts men and women differently, and that women and other marginalized social groups are often more vulnerable to climate change, and also that there are different contributions from different actors, there is a clear need to address gender equality in climate action planning. This is also recognized in Vietnam's own NDC. So SNV, building from and co-financed by one of our projects to recently close, Enhancing Opportunities for Women's Empowerment, funded by the Dutch government, we aim to bring lessons from the field and elaborate a gender-sensitive framework for NDC mainstreaming and planning. The Dutch-funded project supported climate-smart agriculture, working together with women's cooperatives and enterprises in many of Vietnam's most vulnerable, climate-vulnerable Central Coast provinces. So provided really lessons from on the ground and the field. Under this aspect of the work, we have supported consultations in provinces. We've integrated the gender assessment and identification of gender responsive actions in the Lâm Dong planning process. And we've used that experience to elaborate a framework drawing on international best practice from the NDCP itself, as well as other sources, and attempted to put that into a realistic and pragmatic context for Vietnam. And we will hear later today from Ms. Rose Isendijk, who's been brought in as a consultant by SNV to help finalize the framework, and she will outline the framework. And it's vitally important to receive the comments on that from their colleagues and friends. And we hope that this can maybe be a tool that could be widely applied in other forms of subnational climate planning. With that, I would like to conclude by saying that we wish everyone well. We hope we have a very fruitful workshop. We're very thankful both to the NDCP for the provision of additional funds that have been able to do this work. We're very grateful to the Ministry of Planning and Investment for their support. We're also grateful for the support and the working relationship with the 3 provinces, people's committees, as well as departments of planning and investment, and also a special mention to our colleagues at the Ecology and Environment Institute who have been supporting both WRA and SNV in the implementation of these works. So thank you very much. Let's have a great workshop. Yeah, over to you now.
Thank you very much, Richard. Have a very informative and insightful remark, and that already captured the key item for today. So coming up next in the agenda, I would like to share with you the presentation from Dr. Andrea Bassi, the CEO and founder of the Knowledge Organization on the NDC mainstreaming into the provincial planning. Please.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak at this conference. My presentation today will be about the creation of the green economy model for Vietnam that we have developed for 3 different provinces. You can see here in the map, we work with Quang Ni, Lâm Dong, and Bến Tre, and this is a collaboration of the World Resources Institute with the organization I represent, Knowledge, the consulting company that develops customized models for sustainable development, and the New Climate Economy project hosted by the World Resources Institute. Now, the task that we are set out to do is to analyze the system-wide implications of low-carbon development, meaning that we want to achieve low-carbon development, decarbonization of the economy, reducing emissions, but we also want to achieve development. So we want to have economic growth and social empowerment. The task at hand for us is to link low-carbon with development, meaning that we want to understand how they're interconnected with one another, and so how low-carbon investments affect development, and how development influences the potential to reduce emissions, meaning that the more the economy grows, the more energy use and emissions will tend to increase. So we want to understand these interdependencies, and we do that with a system model. We first developed a causal loop diagram or a system map, then we collect the data, then we start customizing the model to make sure that it represents the local context. Now, very briefly, the underlying methodology we used is called systems thinking, and it uses the methodology called system dynamics to integrate social, economic, and environmental indicators. We also use spatial models to make sure that we can look at maps, figure out land cover change, impacts on carbon sequestration, and ecosystem service provisioning. And this information is also embedded in this green economy model. And the outcome of the work is basically forecasts for different indicators, including GDP, employment, for instance, emissions, of course, but also carrying out a cost-benefit analysis by project or by area of investment. Now, this model has been applied to more than 40 countries in the last 10 years or so, and it's a case where we work at the provincial level, and we can aggregate at national level as well. Now, here is a graphical representation of what the model can produce. Basically, there are numbers and equations underlying the model, and then when we run scenarios, the results highlight what are the systemic consequences of either implementing one strategy or a different one. Here on the left side, we see a strategy where we go for deforestation that reduces the hydrological cycle, so there is less water available. There will be soil degradation, less agricultural production, less fishery, and at the same time, more erosion. If we use a different strategy where we reforest the area, we introduce more biodiversity, create opportunities for tourism, and then we have a variety of ripple effects on agriculture, fisheries, and resilience to climatic events, because we have healthy soils. So this is just an example to show you that basically what we're trying to do with these models is to keep balance between social, economic, and environmental trends. So we're able to forecast the trend for population, for land use, for value added and GDP at the provincial level. And then we can add a variety of other indicators, such as land use, water quality or air quality, and biodiversity. And what we want to look at is whether our policies stimulate or trigger growth in certain areas, like in this case for population, land use, and GDP, while at the same time they lead to declines in other areas. Now, this is where we would want to start running alternative scenarios, such as low carbon development scenarios, where we can test whether the outcomes of these policies lead to a more balanced future, where all the indicators are stable or increase at the desired level. Now, here is a more detailed representation of the model. The model, of course, has a lot more variables, but this gives you an idea of the complexity we have in the model and how interconnected the sectors and variables of the model are. But here I want to highlight some key variables that we normally look at. We look at GDP at the center. We then consider employment on the right side and emissions. And these are the variables that tell us more about the low carbon development trends. So emission reduction on the low carbon side, GDP and employment on the development side from a social and economic point of view. Now you can see here that these variables are affected by a variety of others. So they're not simple calculations based on extrapolation of trends, but there are a variety of other dynamics that go on to affect each of these three main variables. But the model, of course, includes all the detail you see here and a lot more. Now, some key information on the model and the type of method it uses. As I said before, it's system dynamics. It's fully customized to the local context. It runs differential equations, and so it basically looks at simulation. And it simulates from the past. For instance, it starts simulating in the year 2000 so that we can then compare the results of the model against history and then continue forecasting until 2050. Now, the model includes various sectors, for instance, population, land use, power generation by energy source, energy demand by sector and energy source, land use with different land cover classes. And all these variables are physical variables that then are connected to economic ones, government accounts, households accounts, and production. So there is really that integration of information that happens in this model. Now, when it comes to emissions, because this is one of the key goals of the project, we use two main data sources. Well, one is the IPCC manual for the National Inventory Report, so that we can have emissions for energy, land use and land cover change, IPPU, that is industrial processes, waste management, livestock and managed soils. And at the same time, we use the National Inventory Report, so the actual data at the country level, to do a calibration of the model. In this case, we used underlying data at the provincial level, such as energy use, land cover change, and so on and so forth, or livestock numbers. But then we applied emission multipliers or intensity of emissions based on the national statistics. Now, we have also included COVID-19, of course, as you can imagine, because it impacts economic activity for the year 2020-21, but also future trends. And here we have considered impact on employments because of the lockdowns or reduction of production due to trade reductions, or productive capital has declined, reduced capital utilization in general, and then reduced consumption investment from the private sector, and more public spending from the government. So trends that affect economic activities. As you can see in these graphs, we have considered for now two major waves with full a recovery or reduced impact, zero impact from COVID, starting from about 2023. So we're expecting at the moment that there will be one more year at least of hardship in adapting and adjusting to the aftermath of the crisis. Now, when it comes to scenarios, the most important part of the analysis we do, we have here a variety of areas where we can implement interventions. And you can see them here. We can work on sustainable agriculture. We can look at sustainable livestock management. We have reforestation. We also have electrification of transport with electric vehicles and motorcycles, electrification of biomass demand for fuel switching, mostly for heating and cooking, for instance, or energy efficiency and renewable energy. So these are examples of the areas of interventions we can include in the model with a specific target and timeline. You see the target here, for the timeline. I wanted to show you here the assumptions used for Lamdong, which are based on the Green Economy Action Plan and refined for stronger ambition in certain areas. So you can see here on the left side the type of policy that we have with specific details on what we're assuming. For instance, the adoption rate of sustainable agriculture. This will be 25% by 2030 and up to 45% by 2050. And this is based on specific indications we find in the Green Economy Action Plan. Then we have other areas. Here we have mostly agriculture and land-based activities. But then here on the left side, we have more of the electrification, so the energy demand side, reduction of petroleum demand because of transport electrification. Again, in this case, up to 50% electrification by 2050. Or we have the use of biomass or biofuels demand, again, to reduce the use of fossil fuels in different sectors. Now, all these assumptions are simulated in the model. We can run them independently, one by one, or we can run them all at the same time with the different timelines and targets. And what I'm showing here is the result of running them all at the same time. So we basically test, what if we implement everything we have planned? What will be the outcomes? Now, in this case, we can see specifically the results for GDP and GDP growth rate for the province of Lamdong here in the graphs, and also a comparison with Ben Tre here at the bottom in the table. So we see that overall, we have a reduction in GDP growth or GDP overall because of COVID-19. At the same time, we see additional GDP because of the intervention options for low carbon development. So low carbon interventions lead to higher economic growth in this case, in the range of 3.7% by 2030 and 12.3% by 2050. And you see here the two lines in the graph for GDP that diverge because of the stronger economic performance when we reduce emissions. Practically, we are reducing energy use, energy cost. We are making more resources available for more investment. We are reducing air pollution, so labor productivity will be higher. So these are all the reasons for having this stronger economic growth. Now, if we compare Lamdong to Ben Tre, we can see that the level of growth that we see in Lamdong is slightly higher than Ben Tre. But that may also be due to the fact that the ambition in Lamdong is a bit higher, or the economic structure of Lamdong is different. Maybe more energy intensive, maybe there is more pollution. So there are different characteristics to the economy that make so that we will have different impacts overall. But one thing we can see is that the ambition for emission reduction between 2020 and 30, up to the point where we have existing targets, is higher. And then it declines over time, and we see also the economic contribution of these low-carbon development options declines. Nevertheless, there is always a positive contribution of the green economy scenario, and that is comparatively stronger in an economy like Ben Tre than Lamdong. But the absolute value is higher for Lamdong because of different underlying drivers of growth. And here you can see the contribution, the net contribution to economic growth of low-carbon interventions. You see strong targets up to 2030. The targets are relaxed a little bit, or the effort is relaxed a little bit, but then towards 2050, we still have growing higher targets. So the usefulness of these models is also shown by this graph, because we can see semi-continuous time. We can inform transitions from one point in time to the other, rather than just showing snapshots. And the same can be said for COVID-19. Here we can see the historical part of a simulation where we match or reproduce the historical data, the green line. And then we have the dip because of COVID, but then we can create different scenarios for economic growth post-COVID. This is based on IMF projections on GDP growth, but then depending on the amount of investment and low carbon effort we put into the system, then we can see different trajectories for GDP growth going forward. Now, of course, GDP is not the only variable included in the model. We have more than 200 indicators in each of the provincial models, but I wanted to show you some of the drivers for change that underline changes in GDP. So one of them is energy demand. Here we are assuming energy efficiency improvement, transport electrification, and that in Lamdong by 2050 leads to 33.6% reduction in energy demand, which is the difference we see between the red line, which is baseline, and the blue line, which is the low carbon scenario. Now, this is, of course, translated into energy demand per capita, per person, but also as energy intensity, energy demand per unit of GDP. So you can see that we can generate different types of indicators for the same type of dynamics. Now, when we look at the electrification of transport specifically, we can see here how the assumption leads to the outcome. So here is the reduction in petroleum demand from electrification, which comes directly from the share of transport that needs to be electrified. You can see we have a target for 2040 linear and then a more ambitious one for 2050. And now this makes so that we have additional electricity demand from electrification of transport, meaning that we have effectively fuel switching. We have a certain amount of energy, liquid fuel, that is avoided, and another amount of energy, electricity, that is added. And now this electricity demand will then be considered in the calculation of power generation, which we see in this second slide here. Now the dynamics here are the following. We see that overall, the generation capacity, so megawatts of technology required for producing electricity and generation, will be lower in the green economy or low carbon scenario. And this also includes the fact that we have more electricity from transport. So this implies that we have a strong effort in this scenario for improving energy efficiency that reduces demand more than the additional requirements for transport, electrified transport. We see also another big effort here, that is improving or expanding the share of renewable energy in power generation with respect to what would have been the baseline scenario. So you can see in this scenario here, we try and stay above 30% of power generation from renewables, avoiding the expected decline we would have in the baseline to about 22%, actually 23.8 by 2030. So this gives us an idea of the model in determining the key drivers of change for the economy. But as I said then, they all sum up to total emissions. And here you see the main categories of emissions, total at the provincial level, and the breakdown by specific sector, in alignment with the IPCC and the National Inventory Report classifications. So you can see that working on energy efficiency, renewable energy, and electrification reduces emissions because we have total emissions from energy. But if we work on reforestation, we increase carbon sinks, and that also reduces emissions from land, maybe even negative, net sink. And that all contributes to a change in annual emissions. Now here again, we see the results overall for Landong, where we can see a 36.4% reduction in total emissions resulting from the combination of all the interventions we have created and GDP growth, which is a force that drives more consumption and energy use and land cover change. But overall here we see a reduction in 36% of emissions, but at the same time we have 12% higher GDP. So we can see here the connection between low carbon and development for the province. Low carbon, 36.4% reduction in emissions, actually leads to higher GDP because of more employment creation, because of cost savings, and so on and so forth. Now, what I want to mention here also is that the estimation of emission is based on spatial models. So here you see on the left side the carbon stored in the province with different values. Red means no carbon storage for urban areas, and blue means high carbon storage for intact habitat. And here on the right side, we convert that map into habitat quality to have an assessment of biodiversity, carrying capacity from an environmental point of view. So you can see we have a variety of tools that come together to shape the analysis that we have performed to effectively link low carbon and development and basically not leave behind any important indicators that policymakers should be aware of. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope that you found this presentation useful. Here you find my contact information. My name is Andrea Bassi. I'm the lead author of this work, together with my colleague Georg Pallaske. Here on the right side, you find contacts from WRI with Arya and Leonardo being project managers and project lead for this exercise. Thank you very much, and I hope you will enjoy also the remainder of the workshop. Thank you. Have a good day.
Yes, definitely a wonderful presentations. And as a citizen of the Fondala city, Lamdong province, I want to reply this again and again, because this is show very strong message that green growth is possible and very positive forecast toward 2030 and 2050. GDP increase and emissions decrease significantly, and also considering of the tough COVID time. Uh, so imagine we adding the gender responsive framework into that. I see it can be increasing GDP and more resilient to the economy. So coming up next, the most exciting topic today, I want to introduce Ms. Rose. We present the gender responsive framework for the NDCs mainstreaming. Please, Mr. Rose. Yes.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I will try to share my screen to share my presentation. Okay, I hope you can all see my screen, and I hope you can all hear me well. So my name is Rose, and I will share today about why gender mainstreaming in climate change action is important, what entry points in climate change action planning could be, what forms of gender-sensitive actions there are, and how can we mainstream in provincial planning, and thereby we will be introducing the gender-sensitive framework and indicators. Afterwards, I hope I realize we're already a little bit time constrained, but I hope there will be time for questions. If not, you can always reach me through email. And also there will be, based on my presentation, the breakout room discussions in which we hope to receive much of your inputs. So why do we want gender mainstreaming in the first place? I think the overarching principle that is important here is that we're striving for substantive gender equality. And substantive gender equality means an equality in outcomes. And this method takes into, or this principle really takes into consideration that really the effects of climate change are not neutral. Also, the baseline in general of just day-to-day life realities is not the same for men and women, but it's different. And so therefore, if you employ regulatory frameworks or policies or planning that is gender neutral, then the outcome of those planning policies would most likely be either that the gender differentiated impacts stay intact or that they are exacerbated. So therefore, a formal gender equality, a gender neutrality of norms and frameworks and policies is not substantial enough to achieve the outcomes of gender equality overall. Now, for the context of climate action specifically, I feel that there are sort of three main motivations for gender mainstreaming. The first one is sort of a moral one, thinking that gender equality and striving for substantive gender equality is the right thing to do. The second one is a little bit opportunistic because those moral convictions have been enshrined in all kinds of international frameworks and treaties and so forth and so on. It means also that the main climate financing institutions have gender strategies guiding their portfolios. And from a pragmatic point of view, climate action will not be effective or sustainable if they do not take gender into account, rightly because climate change impacts are not gender neutral. And considering gender issues in climate change action presents also opportunities to address gender inequalities. Now here I've listed, non-exhaustively, I might add, key areas of gender equality impacts of climate change in Vietnam. So these are all areas in which there are existing gender gaps, even without any impacts of climate change. But in particular in these areas, we see that impacts of climate change exacerbate the existing gaps. So for instance, gender-based violence, the first bullet point. Gender-based violence means all kinds of verbal, non-verbal, and physical violence, either in the domestic sphere, so at home or in a family context, or in the public domain. And overall, regardless of any climate change impacts, it is true that most of the perpetrators in these scenarios are men and most of the victims are women. However, if there is any form of stress on a household, especially economic strain, which can be a consequence, which is often a consequence of structural climate change impacts, as well as if there is a natural disaster, so like one high impact event induced by climate change, both those scenarios would generally mean that there is a big increase in gender-based violence due to stress, whether that be economic strain on a family or otherwise. Then the burden of unpaid care and domestic work is also much higher on women than on men, even though the paid work in Vietnam, women have a very, very high participation rate. And so it's almost equal, the participation in the labor force of men and women. However, when it comes to the burden of unpaid work and unpaid care work, and specifically, the burden on women is much higher, which is also again exacerbated by climate change impacts. And now the same goes for this whole list of women's political representation, participation and leadership, legal status and rights, in particular when it comes to land use certification, which in turn then also affects the access to credit, as well as the access to knowledge and trainings, and the undervaluation of women's participation as agents of change, especially in sectors where there is an overrepresentation of women due to feminization. For instance, in agriculture, the power of women as agents of change should not be underestimated, but should be used. And then regarding health repercussions, that mainly relates to the differences in medical requirements related to reproductive health, which is different, obviously, for men and women. Then regarding Vietnam's policy framework on gender, the three main guiding documents are the Constitution, specifically Article 26, the Gender Equality Law, which sets the priority for all legal documents, including climate change policies and action plans to mainstream gender, and the National Strategy on Gender Equality, which has just been promulgated in March this year for the period of 2021 to 2030. Now, there are also many other laws, such as the land law, the family law, that also have sections on gender equality that are of influence, but these three are sort of the more general guiding legal frameworks for gender equality mainstreaming in Vietnam. Then, when we look at entry points for gender mainstreaming in provincial planning processes, we see that gender mainstreaming is really a top-down process. So it starts at these central level, national level gender mainstreaming institutional incentives, really, that come from the Gender Equality Law and the National Strategy on Gender Equality. And then simultaneously, the NDC and National Climate Change Strategies and the NAP should provide guidance on gender mainstreaming, or in any case, incentives to gender mainstream into further subnational planning. So from there, you go to the review of provincial plans and assessment of available data to assess the risks and vulnerabilities. From there, you can then identify priority sectors and opportunities for gender mainstreaming in climate actions. And the last step in provincial policy planning would be to indicate climate actions by sector and then to quantify targets. So in all of these steps, gender mainstreaming should ideally be considered. Now, for instance, for the NDC, updated in July last year, you can see on page 14 that gender mainstreaming is considered there. And so therefore that should provide the institutional incentive combined with the existing general national frameworks on gender to gender mainstream in the further steps on subnational levels. Now, we've mainly used the gender mainstreaming guide of the NDC P. And that guide uses 5 very important steps that are interconnected at the same time. So the first step would be the use of a gender analysis, which is very important as a baseline, because if you don't know what exactly within a specific province, within a specific area, within a specific sector, are actually the gender differentiated impacts of climate change, then how are you going to address the gaps in that? So it's important to start with a baseline. Then ideally that baseline would obviously be based on sex disaggregated data and gender indicators. The gender indicators are important, well, I'll get to that later also, but are important to set realistically based on the available sex disaggregated data and the sex disaggregated data that can be also be collected ex post in order to enable to make a gender analysis ex ante as well as ex post. Then the gender stakeholders that are responsible for the actions should be identified, which can be any kinds of subnational level governments that have specific functions and responsibilities, which are identified in the draft document we sent out yesterday as well. And in addition, there can be specific tasks for NGOs and CSOs, the Vietnam Women's Union, for instance, as well, to have responsibilities in terms of monitoring and evaluation, for instance, which is especially relevant, of course, in the context of Vietnam, where there is, and this is my next point, a rather limited budget allocation for gender climate actions. And so for that reason, the participation of also NGOs and CSOs will be relatively high, expectedly. Then lastly, there should be a coherence in approach from outcomes to indicators, which basically means that the gender mainstreaming effort should not be an isolated incident that features in either one of the steps in the process I outlined in the previous slide, or in one of these steps outlined here, but it should be mainstreamed throughout the process in a coherent manner. Then, regarding the different forms of gender-sensitive actions, I wanted to outline 4 different forms. Gender-specific climate actions are actions that are aimed directly at closing a gender gap. For instance, I figured, for instance, improving the health needs of women due to poor sanitation as a result of climate shock. Then ensuring climate actions benefit men and women equally. Men and women, like I said, face different obstacles in order to benefit from climate actions. For instance, a specific intervention under a climate action could be the availability of a training. But in effect, if that training is on a time slot, a regular time slot, for instance, that women spend generally on either childcare or other domestic duties such as cooking, then it will be very unlikely to have a high percentage of women participants in the training. So it takes a little bit of extra effort, so to say, to make sure that the women can participate in a meaningful way on an equal or a level playing field, so to say, as men in these instances. Managing and mitigating gender-related issues or risks of climate actions. So these regard the indirect effects of climate actions, which may have a negative effect on gender equality and should, where possible, be anticipated by ex-ante assessment of gender differentiated effects of proposed actions. So for instance, in the context of green public transport initiatives, you can think of an unwanted side effect of an increase in use of public transport could be that often also means an increase in sexual harassment in the public sphere. And a way of mitigating that would be, for instance, a communications campaign or an increase of light at bus stops and in public transport itself to mitigate the risk that is this side effect. Climate actions that promote gender equality goals. Well, ideally, climate actions would equally improve gender equality goals as strive for core climate action objectives. And an example of this was, for instance, the cook stoves initiative in Lamdong that had an extremely positive health impact, but mainly for women because they're mainly the ones using the cook stoves, as well as the obvious benefit of reducing indoor air pollution. Then we get to the proposed gender mainstreaming framework, which, like I said, according also to the NDCP guidance, starts with a gender analysis. The gender analysis starts with the identification and review of relevant policies and secondary information. I think I just outlined that already. So point B is the collection of primary information. Now we understand that this is quite challenging in many instances due to the limited resources in terms of time, in terms of budgeting. However, we do stress that if there is any effort for data collection, that there will be regard for the sex disaggregated component, as well as disaggregation by other vulnerabilities, such as age or disability, for instance. Then the analysis we propose, based on the main areas of gender differentiated impacts of climate change, 6 different thematic areas or topical areas that the analysis should focus on ideally, which are legal rights and status, power and influence, access to and control over assets and different forms of capital, divisions of labor and allocation of time, gender-based violence, and women as agents of change. A gender analysis conclusion should always also conclude with a consultation, because it's important that the gender analysis comes to shape in a way that is participatory and allows for multi-stakeholder consultation, so that any community level participation is included in the gender analysis. Then there should be considerations also for intersectionality of vulnerabilities, so gender, but also intersectionality, for instance, with age or disability, like I said. Then the outcome of the gender analysis should be the gender differentiated impacts of climate change, as well as the gender differentiated impacts of the climate actions, and what the potential contributions of women and other disadvantaged groups could be, which falls within the realm really of the women agents of change aspects, and the potential gender differentiated impacts of climate actions in different sectors, again, ex post as well as ex ante. So sort of a forecast as well as an evaluation afterwards. So introducing the gender indicators, the central question that the gender indicators should ideally answer would be, are the proposed climate actions gender sensitive or even also gender responsive? It is important to use simple, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound indicators. This, of course, poses at the same time also challenge in all of these 5 different requirements. Specifically for this framework, the suggested indicators are based on the NDC, the National Strategy on Gender Equality, development programs on climate change in the past decade or so in Vietnam, the Lam Dong experience, of course, and the indicators may be quantitative or qualitative, though the suggestions are predominantly quantitative. But I think more importantly also they of course, depend on the proposed climate action, first and foremost. They depend on the specific geographical area. They depend on the sector that they are addressing. And they depend on whether they're aimed at the outcome or the output or the impact level and so forth. So these are all important considerations to keep in mind, because it signals that it's quite complicated to get to very concrete gender indicators in a framework that, you know, hopefully can be useful to any kind of provincial level planning in Vietnam. As a general guidance, it may be useful to use also the gender marker guide of the United Nations globally, which has Gen 0 as an indication for an action that is not expected to contribute noticeably to gender equality, to gender marker 3, meaning that gender equality is the principal objective of the action. And so that could be a way of qualifying your action and also categorizing then your indicators. Now, we use the topical areas of the gender analysis as indicative for a categorization of gender indicators. So I put some examples here. There in the draft document there are more, and I hope we'll get some reflections and inputs on this also in the breakout rooms. So, for instance, on legal rights and status, you could look at number of women signatories on land certificates, or the percentage of women in formal and informal employment. I hope the indicators that I suggested here are also indicators or data that are regularly collected in the national surveys. And so for that reason, you don't need to be dependent on resource allocation on the provincial level to receive information on these specific indicators. So, and I think as the last one on gender-based violence, that is a very particularly challenging topical area to collect data on. It really only a comprehensive data on gender-based violence in Vietnam has been collected in 2009 and 2019, and hopefully again in 2029. But it's a particularly sensitive area, and unfortunately also often very much contested in terms of data collection and quantification as well as analysis. So we recognize that as well. So I don't know if there is time for questions. I would be happy to receive them. And otherwise, we can discuss further in the breakout rooms, of which there will be two, one English-speaking group and one Vietnamese-speaking group, which we will start after the break.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a wonderful presentation. And I think seems like nobody share any question in the chat box. I think they ready to use all of the energy to the group discussion in the breakout room. And I think now it's have the chance to share and have some memory of this workshop. So please, everyone, turn on your camera and for the group photo picture. Yeah. So we will have like 30 seconds for everyone to turn on their camera. I hope everybody is change their virtual background. Rose, can you stop share the screen? Okay, wonderful.
Wonderful, yeah.
Yeah, I can see everybody now.
Yes.
Okay, hi. I will let you like 1 minute to take the photo, group photo. Maybe I need to count like 1, 2, 3, and then everybody smile.
Okay. Ainam, please.
Yeah. Okay. Like 1, 2, 3.
Okay, one more.
Yeah.
One more. Okay.
1, 2, 3. Thank you.
Okay, excellent, everyone. I think as an organizer, let me have a chance to reduce some of the coffee break and tea break time, like 10 minutes. And I think after the coffee break, we will have like a group discussion for 45 minutes. There's Ruth already introduced the two groups, one international and one Vietnamese. So Ruth will lead the international group, and Mr. Kim will lead the Vietnamese group. During coffee break time, we will share the topic for group discussion, so you can enjoy thinking of the topic and drink coffee or tea or water, anything. So we will come back 10:20. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoy your coffee or tea. So we will have a breakout group discussion in 45 minutes, and we will discuss about the topic we shared earlier and share with the chat box. And we also have the leader of the group. Ruth will be the leader of Group 1 International, and Mr. Takin, Group 2 will lead the Group 2. And after that, we will come back to have a report back. So please assign one note taker and one presenter in your group. And okay, and now Mr. Hai, please open the breakout room so people can freely choose join the room. Yeah. You can see the breakout room button in the bottom of the Zoom function.
Yes, I can see many attitude John in the two groups.
Namoy, can you repeat the instructions how to join the group?
Yeah, so you can see the function in the bottom of the Zoom. So you can see it said the breakout room. So you click on that and you can hit the join button into the international group or Vietnam group. Yeah, I can see many people already join. Yeah. It will leave the plenary session into the group. Yeah.
Yes, welcome. We have a very lively and successful discussion. Yeah.
Great to hear.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Kian, and thank you everyone for very exciting group discussion. I have been joining group 1 and group 2, so I can see a lot of energy there. So I think each group would like to hear a little bit about what happening in the other group. So Ruth, please. Can you share a key summary of the group 1? Did you nominate anyone from your group? And we have like less than 10 minutes for each group. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Nam. I think we nominated me. I took some notes, so I will try to summarize as I go through them. So I think we first discussed about the provincial planning having not just indicators, but having it being guided by targets, especially as well, and the alignment with other guiding documents that are underway to guide the national level planning into subnational and provincial planning. Then there were very important reflections, I think, on the usefulness of the framework and of the targets in specific sectors. So there were reflections, for instance, on the forestry sector, and in summary or in conclusion, the indicators were found good, but for operational level, they need to be converted still to tailor them to specific sectors and make them more responsive to that, from the approach of the climate action to the impact. And a big problem, or really the main challenge that was identified in this regard, was the lack of data. and the lack of a data structure of the Vietnamese government, which does not necessarily always include the things that the indicators would want to monitor. So then we discussed to consider umbrella indicators that can be specified by sector and even subsector, that were based or that were originated from the NDC indicators. Then regarding to the specific indicators, there were some recommendations. For instance, to include an indicator on the meaningful participation of women in planning processes. So it's like a process indicator in that regard. Then there were also in that same context, there were reflections on the gender mandate on a national and therefore also line ministry level, being on gender or being for Molisa specifically, and other ministries maybe not having specific departments for gender, or not even having many, especially in subnational levels, not having many women staff. I might add to that actually that in the National Strategy on Gender Equality, the target for 2030 is 35% of leadership positions in the political sphere on all levels should be women. In any case, then it was also suggested that the Vietnam Women's Union would be a good resource on the provincial level. And then there was regard for the indicators regarding the gender responsive budgeting, which is another, next to data collection, was another big challenge that was identified in our group, just because there is very limited resource allocation for climate change, and therefore there's a high dependency on other ministries and other sectors, such as agriculture, such as trade and industry, to incorporate, first of all, climate actions, and then secondly, also the gender responsiveness of those climate actions. So there's a need for a comprehensive approach in that regard that doesn't just that isn't just targeted at climate change, but also at other sectors. So it would also be relevant for other ministries and line ministries and their departments on subnational levels. Please, if others have more, right, there was also consideration on the indicators on the participation of women as in climate change actions as recipients or as beneficiaries, as some international experience in the region has shown that some resource allocation gets stuck on sort of community leadership level and doesn't always trickle down to households, especially if they're women-led households. So I think, I don't know if anyone from my group has anything to add to that. Please feel free.
No, I think it's fine. So, well done, Ross.
Yeah, sorry, there is something I forgot to mention during the breakout room, so just wanted to quickly point it out now for everyone. Just to say that UNDP is just about to sign a letter of agreement with MPI in order to develop a new circular to replace Circular 5 on mainstreaming DRR and climate change into the SCDP planning at all levels. So then they will work directly with MPI in order to support the practical application of this new circular in Nam Dinh province, so covering provincial, district, and commune level. So that potentially could interest, actually all colleagues. So it's not me directly working on this, but it's Khrushchev, my colleague. So I'm happy to put you in touch and continue the discussion on this, because we could definitely include some gender indicator on this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think it's time for Mr. Kim to share your group. And I see there's a lot of interesting discussion over there.
Yes, on behalf of the group, I would like to invite Mr. Hua. We also have a presenter and another. Mr. Hua, please, can you quickly present on the key points, and then I will add. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Mr. Kian. On behalf of the Vietnamese group, I would like to summarize some key points of the discussion. In our group, we have discussed about the NDC mainstreaming framework and as well as gender mainstreaming frameworks. Most of the ideas that they should not separate those framework. It should be one, and NDC mainstreaming framework and should consider.
Okay, thank you. This I just continue and clarify that the key point that the participants highlight is that we should not, let's say, focus just only on one gender issues or climate change, but this should be combined. And we should always remember that our main purpose is to mainstream NDC into the provincial planning in a gender sensitive way. This is the best. And second point, very important, is that we should always focus on the so-called concrete actions or concrete guidance, because there is a huge gap when you go down to the planning at the provincial level, and people just always saying that, okay, this is very important, even compulsory for some projects. They are kind of doing these activities and want to include, but they don't know how. So the question is not only to talk these issues, but also to guide this and make it into action. So one of the participants highlighted that the matrix and the two tables that we already highlight during our consultation process in Lâm Đồng province, with more detailed information and guidelines, which we revise can be used. Also, there is important highlights from UNDP is that the planning should focus, should have the very concrete indicators to specifically to each of the sector specific and area specific, even project specific. Again, the focus on how rather than to do what. And one interesting highlight is that even the women union is always have been perceived as the key institution to cover the gender issue. So other agencies at the provincial level somehow neglecting, and they think that this is the issue by women union. So we need to very important to raise the awareness and change behavior of the provincial planner and provincial highest leader regarding these issues. It's not just a women union matter, but it's in all agencies. And from there, it's very important to focus on the capacity building and awareness raising activities for the public, for the leaders, and the education for the next generations, which are already highlighted by other participants. We have overall a lot of interest in guidance and in the indicators sets, in the guiding matrix that can be useful for mainstreaming NDC and gender in the planning process. And yeah, there are a lot of information about the current activities of various institutions that our projects can fit into, can support with the concrete guidance and products. So that's from our group. Maybe I missed some points, so if the participant can add something, please, from the Vietnamese discussion group. So that's it. If there is no more additional points, so those are the key points. Again, I would like to point out that the matrices, the checklist and indicator sets are most important to help the mainstreaming to planning process.
Thank you, Mr. Kin, and perfect timing. So we also very appreciate if you can provide written comment to us, and we can complete the framework and share back to you. And finally, I would like to introduce Mr. Richard Rasto. We will have a concluding remark, please.
I just wondered if before I did so, I did notice that we were joined today by Mr. Dio Gabinete from NDCP. If he's still here, would you like to have a quick word? No. Okay, he's not. He's maybe perhaps he's left early. I know he's based in Bangkok, so he's more on the time zone that that we are on, whereas the rest of NDCP colleagues are normally not. Okay, so yes, to conclude, yeah, I think that we've had an interesting and yeah, very richly rewarding workshop today. So we have shared some of the experiences and lessons learned from applying the green economy model earlier in the day from Dr. Andrea Bassi. I think that one thing I would add to that presentation was very much focused on how we applied the green economy model in conjunction with WRI. As I noted, there was an excellent question from Mr. Nue from GIZ in the chat box. We didn't mention or didn't go into in that presentation how our how that modeling was used within the context of Vietnamese planning. So all the way through, we have been following, and it hasn't been easy because there's been a lot of confusion. Let us remember that the new planning law is new, and then the accompanying decree and circular only came in 2019 for the new integrated planning approach. There was much confusion among sectors and provinces as to how this planning approach would be applied. So we have had to learn and adjust on our feet as to indeed how this would play out, and then how we would integrate NDC mainstreaming within that process. And I think that we have some lessons in terms of that, and we have found appropriate entry points within that planning process to engage. I would note that with regard to the the lesson learning from the NDC mainstreaming in Lamdong, Ben Chia, and Quang Ninh. SNV and WRI will be jointly soon producing a knowledge product, which will be relatively brief, sort of 15 pages or so, that will share some of this experience, and then it will cover not only how the green economy model was implemented, but also how it was implemented in the context of the Vietnamese planning system. So that will be coming out very soon. Yes, then we had the consultation with, Rose introduced the gender sensitive framework that we've been working on. I'd like to highlight that I think that we both follow the international best practice, but we have added some details, I think, which are important when you get down to the granular level at the local levels. In particular, I'd like to highlight some of the features of the model in terms of the way that we're providing additional guidance on how you would structure or break down gender analysis. Very often we've seen the gender differentiated impacts of climate change is generally there. We also see increasing emphasis on the agency of women and other marginalized groups in terms of climate actions. That is often there. What is often not seen, and we don't see in the guidance, existing guidance from NDCP, for example, is the consideration of climate actions and what are the gender impacts of those climate actions. So we've introduced that and suggested ways that you can conduct ex post assessments and analyses of climate change actions and what the gendered impacts of those have been, and that then provides you with a basis for ex ante predictions or analysis of potential risks of continuing those actions or applying similar types of climate responses, and then what are the gendered impacts thereof. So I think that's a new dimension. I think we've introduced also within the topical themes, provides a bit more structure as to how you can break down your gender analysis. I don't think that's revolutionary, but it's useful to have there, and that's another addition. And this also helps us frame what are then the appropriate gender sensitive or gender responsive climate actions. So then in that light, also I think the framework is we're trying to offer a little bit more in terms of defining, okay, what is a gender sensitive or gender responsive climate action when it comes to pass on the ground. And then the other thing is, of course, contextualizing this in the Vietnam context. The discussions seem to have been very rich, and thank you all so much for your contributions and ideas. And as Nam says, please keep them coming. We are very much open to written suggestions over the next, please do it soon, because we would like to finalize our outputs for the NDCP quite swiftly. But yes, definitely open to those ideas. I think I heard today, just through the discussions, some good suggestions on specific indicators, but also perhaps through the discussions emerging a kind of a realization that for the provincial planning process itself, it should be more about setting targets, like overall targets, and then an umbrella framework through which indicators may then be determined in greater detail by sectors and even subsectors. So I think that's one very good takeaway from me, but there were also other very good points around different types of indicators, process, impact, some of the challenges, little data available, good discussion around the budgeting issue, another big challenge as we move forward. Speaking of moving forward, so the next steps for us will be to bring in your comments, your ideas, your suggestions into let's say a final for now product. I think we are all learning in this space as we try to it's very challenging for provinces to both integrate the NDCs within their provincial plans, and then subsequently their socioeconomic development plans, and then their sectoral plans. So the more that we can work together on this topic and provide more structured guidance, the better it is. So we look forward to sifting through all of these points and recommendations and moving towards, as I say, the finalized knowledge product for working together with WRI on mainstreaming NDCs in provincial planning, and then also finalizing the gender sensitive framework. So they're very much the next steps for us with regard to the NDCP assignment. But even as that draws to a close, of course, SNV and all the development partners, we look forward to working together, notably through the climate change working group initiatives, looking at the NAP M&E indicators, which, by the way, we've also strongly considered how to harmonize within this. So I guess the last point for me to finally conclude is to thank everybody so much for your consideration of the key issues here. To thank all of our partners throughout the implementation of the project, the coordination that we've had with other development partners as well. GIZ, UNDP, our implementation partners, EEI, WRI, and of course, thanks to MPI and Monterey when we've engaged with them. Of course, thanks at the provincial levels for their participation and engagement with these processes. And then so finally, I should say thanks so much. Take care of yourselves in these difficult times, and we look forward to seeing and meeting you all in person when this is all over. And maybe it's not over, but in the near future. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and everyone. Stay safe and stay healthy. With this, I think we end the consultation workshop. See you in the near future. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
Thank you.
Nice to work with you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Stay safe.